Hi folks, so I am doing here a review of the Hanwei coffin handle Bowie. Now Hanwei decided, I think it was about 5 years ago, maybe a bit more than that now, to make a line of historical Bowie knives. They have since become, as far as my experience is, they've become slightly more difficult to get hold of. And I suspect because maybe they didn't price them right, or maybe they didn't market them right, or maybe people just didn't like the product, but they don't seem to have done that well in the marketplace. However, I think it's a fairly decent product. This is very different to most of the Bowie knives that you'll get from other knife makers, in that Hanwei have made an effort to try and make a sort of historically accurate version of a Bowie knife, and they released about 6 different models, and each of them represented an average of an actual type of Bowie knife. For the most part, they were popular between the 1840s through to about the 1870s for the large part. Most of them, the sort of Bowie knife being at its height in the 1840s and 50s, really. Okay, so this coffin handle type is fairly common type in the period, particularly in the 1840s. I personally like this type. It's one of my favourite styles of Bowie knife. The first thing that I was surprised about when I got it was that it is smaller than I expected. My previous experience of Bowie knives was that, of replica Bowie knives, was that they were all quite big. And in a way, I was actually quite impressed that Hanwei had the guts to make what's actually a more realistic or historically common size of Bowie knife. So, as I spoke about in a previous video, most historical antique Bowie knives that you find are actually not that big. They're not Crocodile Dundee or Rambo sized knives. Most of them are only got kind of between 6 and 9 inch blades. Yes, you do get bigger Bowie knives with 12, 14, 16 inch blades, particularly in Mexico and in the Confederate States during the Civil War. But the majority of Bowie knives, many of which incidentally were made in England, not in America, Sheffield mass-produced them, and indeed the German companies in Solingen mass-produced them as well. Most of those only had kind of 7, 8, 9 inch blades at the most. So it's a common size, it's a common shape. How historical is it apart from that? Well, one impressive thing also is that they used carbon steel for the blade, which I personally like. I prefer carbon steel on blades, partly because I'm a bit of a historical purist, and stainless steel just doesn't really do it for me. But also because I prefer sharpening carbon steel. Now, I don't know whether it's in my head, but I've always found that carbon steel blades are easier to sharpen and, for the most part, maintain a sharp edge for longer. Although I will concede that good stainless steel is technically harder. It might be more brittle, but it's harder on the edge in general than most carbon steels that are used in knives and swords. But I certainly prefer sharpening carbon steel. Of course, the disadvantage of carbon steel is that the blade will get rusty or oxidise if you don't look after it. So you have to be careful about handling the blade and oiling it if you do stick your greasy fingers on it. So, the knife itself, it is made the standard slabs on a solid tang construction. However, a suspicion I have with the Hanwei is that what you see at the edges there is not the tang. In fact, it's not really a suspicion, I'm pretty much certain. Because of the way it's constructed, I'm fairly certain that what you can see at the edges here on the Hanwei is not the tang, but is instead a sort of metal placer that is around the tang. I think that the tang is a bit narrower than the grip and goes down the centre there and doesn't flare out at the pommel. The flared out pommel, incidentally, is not an uncommon feature. It's not really coffin handled, strictly speaking, but it does stop your hand sliding off the end. It's not, to me, as comfortable as the coffin handled version. But, you know, it is representative of a historical type that was fairly common in the 1840s and 50s. We come up to a bolster that's fairly standard. I do note that it's made of sheet brass, I believe, because you can see a join at the front there where it's been folded around. So it's not a casting, it is a working of sheet metal that is sort of folded around, I believe. And then we have a flat guard that's fairly nicely shaped, nice and rounded. Other fairly typical kind of shape that you find on lots of original antique Bowie knives. Moving up to the blade, it's carbon steel as I mentioned. When I got this, it was not terribly sharp, but it did sharpen very easily. I sharpened it myself. And you'll notice it has the Spanish notch, which nobody really knows what it's for. There's various urban myths about it being used for catching an opponent's blade, which is almost certainly rubbish, because that's just not a very practical thing to do. And also you'd snap off the lower part if you did try to do that. So there's various theories about it being used for various trades and tools and crafts. But the short story is that no one really knows exactly what the Spanish notch is for, much like the notch at the base of a cookery blade, incidentally. Maybe they had the same use and we've forgotten what they're both for. It has what looks like a false edge, but the false edge is not really sharpened. Of course you could sharpen it yourself, but it doesn't come sharpened as standard. And the blade is essentially what I would call a flat wedge, that is, it has no filler. And it just is a direct gradient from the back edge to the front sharp edge. Okay, and it has one thing that's really notable about the Hanwei Bowie knives is they have really good distal taper. So a bit like the Elkridge Bowie, which I spoke about previously, this has really good distal taper and is therefore actually really, really light. So it's not a heavy chunky Bowie knife like some of you may be used to, or like most modern low end and frankly some expensive ones as well. Bowies are really big and chunky, and actually the antique ones, not always the case, but the antique ones tend to be quite light and have a lot of distal taper and be quite thin in the end region of the blade, and this does match that description. Okay. The scabbard is actually very nicely made. It's one of the best features of these Hanwei daggers. They're really nicely stitched at the back there, and it's got brass fittings at throat and chape at the end there, or drag, depending what you want to call it, and it's actual real leather, really stitched with nice brass fittings on it. There are two things that I would change about the scabbard. One is, you'll see at the top there, it has a plate with an opening cut for the blade to go into. This is only going to serve to blunten your edge, and I think it was silly that they put that plate on. It may be historical. Personally, I've never seen a historical one with this on, but they may have copied it from a historical one. But I would have left that off simply because if you leave that plate off, then the edge is only going to be touching leather when it goes in, and it's not going to be bluntening it as much. Everything bluntens a blade, even leather, surprisingly, but clearly a brass plate that the edge is going to rub against is not going to do the edge any good, so I would have left that plate off. The other thing which is a bit weird is the belt loop. I have never personally seen an antique example with a belt loop really like that. It's brazed on. Functionally it's okay, it will certainly work fine, but it just seems a bit intrusive. It sticks out quite far, and there are certain positions in which you might want to wear the knife in which that might become uncomfortable. So I'm not really a big fan of that belt loop. I personally would have probably put a leather one on, or just a flatter brass one with an open end, like a leaf essentially. So there we go, that's the Hanwei Bowie, I believe it's the Vicksburg, and it's quite a nice piece, but I do think that Hanwei probably slightly overpriced these when they first released them, and that's part of why they didn't do very well. But they're quite nice daggers. They're not fantastic, there's much better out there, but considering that they had the guts to go with a historical design and stick with that, I think they did a fairly good product. And it's not very easy to get historically designed and historically fairly pure Bowie knives without spending big bucks. So Hanwei filled a kind of niche. It may not have been a very popular niche, but it was a niche that they filled. Okay, cheers.